In just 5 minutes, Karoline Leavitt was handcuffed in open court, and Judge Travers thought he'd taught her a lesson. But what he didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett was already holding a federal emergency stay. A snowstorm outside, a biased courtroom inside, and one black attorney ready to expose the entire system. What made a federal judge walk out in silence, with no one clapping and no one following? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Snow blanketed the city like a white sheet over something dying. It didn't swirl. It stabbed. Sharp flakes tapped against the tall windows of Summit Heights Federal Courthouse, bouncing off the cold glass like nature itself was trying to break in. Inside courtroom 3B, not a soul dared to speak above a whisper. But in the middle of that frozen silence, one figure stood still, rooted like a monument refusing to bow. Karoline Leavitt. Her heels were planted, her spine perfectly straight, and her eyes locked on the bench ahead. She wasn't nervous. She was defiant, but not out of pride, out of principle. She had come here to testify about falsified job loss data tied to a federal report. But it was clear from the first 5 minutes, this wasn't going to be a fair hearing. Judge Malcolm Travers had made that obvious. Every time Karoline tried to explain the regional disparities in the labor numbers, he cut her off. Once when she quoted the Bureau of Regional Analytics, again when she brought up a peer-reviewed paper that contradicted the state's position. His tone wasn't neutral. It was loaded, condescending, polished but poisonous, like a man trying to dress his personal bias in the robe of the law. Twice he reminded her to stay within scope, but the scope, it seemed, only applied to her. When the state's witness had drifted off topic earlier, Travers hadn't said a word. It wasn't justice. It was theater, and Karoline was the outsider who hadn't received the script. Then it happened. Travers leaned forward with the kind of silence that screams control. He adjusted his glasses like a man preparing to strike. "Miss Leavitt," he said slowly, "this is your final warning. Another interruption or off-topic statement, and I will hold you in contempt of court." The words were ice, the message was fire. Everyone in the room knew what he meant. Sit down, stay quiet, or pay the price. But Karoline didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, almost frightening in its steadiness. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm not here to play by broken rules. I'm here to tell the truth. If that truth offends this court, then maybe this court is the one in contempt." The silence that followed was not the respectful kind. It was the kind that comes just before something explodes. A young reporter gasped. A woman in the gallery dropped her notebook. Even the bailiff looked up, unsure of what would happen next. Travers didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just grabbed his gavel and brought it down with a single brutal strike. Bang! "Enough! Bailiff, take her into custody. She is in contempt of court." The command was sharp, final, absolute. But something strange happened. No one moved. For 2 full seconds, the courtroom was paralyzed. The court reporter had stopped typing mid-sentence. The junior attorney for the prosecution actually dropped his legal pad. It was as if time itself had paused to process the insanity of what had just been said. Arresting a witness, mid-testimony, for refusing to be silenced? Even in a courtroom known for heavy-handed judges, this was beyond the pale. It wasn't law, it was punishment. And still, Karoline didn't react. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She didn't even ask why. She just turned, slowly, and brought her hands behind her back, palms open, wrists together. The bailiff hesitated again, this time visibly unsettled. He looked at Judge Travers as if to confirm the order, but the judge didn't meet his eyes. He looked straight ahead, jaw tight. And so, with hands that had never shaken this much before, the bailiff snapped cold steel around Karoline's wrists. The sound of the cuffs locking echoed like gunshots. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Karoline stood, back to the crowd, arms bound, but head held higher than anyone else in that room. Her silence wasn't defeat. It was resistance. Powerful, unbending. The kind of silence that says more than 100 speeches ever could. Because everyone there, every lawyer, every clerk, every journalist, realized at that moment this wasn't about contempt of court. It was about control. It was about silencing someone who dared to say what others wouldn't. And in choosing to stand tall in shackles, Karoline had just exposed the entire charade. Justice wasn't blind today, it had blinked. And everyone saw it. No one dared to move. Karoline Leavitt stood with her wrists bound, cuffed in front of the gallery like a criminal. Her posture was straight, chin high, eyes unblinking, but the symbolism was undeniable. She hadn't just been silenced. She'd been displayed. A warning, a public lesson carved in steel. The courtroom didn't breathe. It watched. And then, from the row just behind the defense table, a chair shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it carried weight like thunder on marble. A shadow stood, quiet but commanding. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat like a woman answering a calling, not a cue. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, no glance toward co-counsel. Just movement, controlled, intentional, and anchored in decades of knowing exactly when to strike. She was known, not in the celebrity sense, but in the kind of way that echoes behind closed doors. The kind of lawyer judges warned each other about over private lunches. The kind of strategist who didn't come to play defense. She came to rewrite the game. Former senior legal advisor to the White House, a woman who had argued before the circuit courts in 6 states, a reputation built not on volume, but accuracy, timing, and unshakable nerve. And now she was standing, centered in a courtroom where the rules had been bent so far they were already snapping. Her voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Your Honor, the defense objects. Every syllable was deliberate, cold, clean. The kind of tone that doesn't ask for the room, it takes it. This arrest is in direct violation of federal order. An emergency stay was signed and filed this morning at 9:42 a.m. by Judge Aaron Halverson, U.S. District Court. This courtroom is currently acting outside its jurisdiction. She didn't look angry. She didn't look afraid. She looked like a wall of black glass, impenetrable, polished, and unforgiving. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her voice didn't rise, but everything else in the room did. Tension, eyes, heart rates. Judge Travers sat stiff behind the bench. His fingers dug into the wood as he leaned forward, a tremor barely restrained in his neck. He didn't even attempt diplomacy. He went straight to denial. This court has not received such a filing, he snapped. If no stay appears in the docket, it holds no weight here. This hearing will continue, under my discretion. He said discretion like a weapon. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't answer with words at first. She moved. From the side of her briefcase, she withdrew a large white envelope. Thick, stiff, sealed with a crimson stamp of the U.S. District Court and the unmistakable emblem of federal urgency. Her nails, trimmed square and clean, barely made a sound as she opened the fastener. She didn't hand the document to the judge. She walked forward, heels clicking like a metronome for measured destruction, and handed it directly to the court clerk. That act alone rewrote the hierarchy of the room. Gasps didn't erupt, but heads turned, eyebrows lifted. Because in a room where the judge reigned like an emperor, Jasmine had just bypassed him entirely. It wasn't rebellion. It was protocol, weaponized with lethal precision. Travers watched, his face stone, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered, hesitated, calculated. The control was slipping, and he knew it. The clerk received the envelope with both hands, as if accepting a sacred relic. He opened it carefully, eyes scanning the front page once, then again. Silence tightened its grip on every row of the gallery. Karoline hadn't moved. The bailiff, still standing beside her, glanced back at the judge, waiting. The clerk's lips parted slowly. Your Honor, he said, voice cautious but unmistakable. This is an active federal order. Emergency stay 447B, filed and signed at 9:42 a.m. by Judge Halverson. Time-stamped, electronically logged. It's binding. He paused. His eyes flicked upward. Sir, it overrides the contempt action issued here. The blow didn't land like a slap. It landed like a slow crack in the floor beneath Trevor's feet. He didn't respond. His mouth tightened. His shoulders didn't fall, but something in them slouched just enough to show the damage. He wasn't used to being contradicted, and he definitely wasn't used to being overruled. Jasmine held her position, a pillar of absolute stillness. She didn't gloat. didn't smile. She just stood there, letting the law do what it was built to do when wielded by the right hands. Finally, Trevor spoke, low, clipped. "We will recess for 15 minutes. No apology, no acknowledgement, just retreat." And then he vanished behind the chamber door like a man escaping a fire he'd set himself. Time in courtroom 3B no longer ticked. It watched. The second hand on the wall-mounted clock moved, but no one followed it. Conversations died before they began. The gallery didn't dare shift in their seats. Karoline stood cuffed, but upright. Jasmine stood still, but commanding. And the judge's bench, once the source of dread, now sat vacant, like a throne abandoned mid-battle. The court had been suspended, yes, but the tension hadn't. It thickened with every breath. The kind of silence you only hear when something irreversible has happened. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't pounded a podium, hadn't issued threats, but she had stopped the show with a signature, a timestamp, and a stare that never blinked. She hadn't moved since the clerk confirmed the stay. Arms folded lightly in front of her, one heel subtly angled, like she was ready to pivot on a moment's notice. Her focus was absolute. Not on the press, not on the clerk, not even on Karoline. Her eyes were locked on the empty space where power had once sat and fled. Jasmine didn't need to say she had control. The room had already felt it. She was a master of timing, not noise. She didn't speak unless the sentence had already been rehearsed in a dozen scenarios, and every one of them ended with her being right. Karoline shifted slightly, her cuffed wrists moving just enough for her to glance sideways. The look she gave Jasmine wasn't one of panic or desperation. It was curiosity, cautious respect, a flicker of awe buried beneath layers of control. Her voice barely escaped her throat, but it carried enough weight to land. "Did you expect this?" she asked, low and steady. "That he'd try something like this?" Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't need to. Her answer came like a cold, clean edge slicing through the haze. "I didn't guess," she said. "I prepared." 3 words, flat, unemotional, and yet they vibrated like thunder in the bones of anyone within earshot. It wasn't just confidence, it was certainty forged from experience. Jasmine hadn't hoped this might happen. She had calculated that it could, and that made all the difference. It's why the envelope had already been signed, why the document had already been filed, why she hadn't flinched when Travers flexed his authority, because she knew his bluff would collapse under the weight of real law. The bailiff, still standing beside Karoline, shifted uneasily. He hadn't removed the cuffs yet. No order had been given, but the delay wasn't about protocol anymore. It was about fear. No one wanted to make the wrong move now, not with the room balanced on Jasmine's next step. Even the clerk stayed motionless, the emergency stay still on the desk in front of him, like a relic too sacred to touch twice. And above, far above, through a narrow pane of tinted bulletproof glass, a single man watched the room unfold like an open file. His eyes tracked movement, not dialogue. His ears registered tone, not content. His face was still, unreadable. He had no badge on display, no uniform, just a federal tablet resting on his lap, a stylus between his fingers, and a government-issued ID card tucked inside a side pocket that read, Judicial Oversight Division, Office of Internal Review. He wasn't just observing, he was documenting everything. He'd seen the moment Trevor slammed his gavel, ordering a woman cuffed for speaking. He'd seen the silence that followed. He'd seen the fear, not in the defendant, but in the officials. And then, most importantly, he'd seen Jasmine Crockett stand up and flip the momentum with surgical control. He'd tapped a digital marker at 10:03 a.m., logging the precise second she handed the stay to the clerk. He tapped again when Travers fled the room. He noted posture, vocal tone, deviation from procedural standard. He logged the judge's reaction, the room's delay in executing or reversing the detainment order, and the body language of the defense counsel. But most of all, he wrote one phrase in the private comment section of his log. Subject Jasmine Crockett. No observable errors. Tactical execution under duress. Exemplary. Back below, Karoline let out a shallow breath, cuffed but calm. She didn't feel like the target anymore. She felt like the last domino that had been placed just right. Jasmine had seen the whole game 5 moves ahead, and now with the judge in hiding, the law on paper, and the balance of power realigning in total silence, there was nothing left to guess. Jasmine didn't guess. She planned for this exact moment, and now everyone else had to catch up. When Judge Travers returned to the bench, the room didn't relax. If anything, the tension deepened. He looked more controlled now, more polished, but it wasn't peace. It was strategy. He hadn't backed down. He'd simply chosen a new weapon. Data. Clean. Cold. Deceptive. He cleared his throat and announced, "We'll proceed with evidentiary testimony. The state may call its witness." And just like that, the trap door opened. The courtroom door swung open, and a man in a crisp gray suit walked in with quiet confidence. His name was Jonas Pratt, senior analyst from the Department of Labor Analytics. He moved like a man used to being listened to, used to being right. He took the stand with stiff posture, adjusted his glasses, and looked straight ahead. Not at Karoline, not at the defense. His eyes were on the numbers, just the numbers. The assistant district attorney, Len Richter, stood. His voice was smooth but loaded. "Mr. Pratt, you reviewed Ms. Leavitt's statements on labor projections made in her February interview, correct?" "Yes, I did," Pratt replied. "And were those projections accurate?" Pratt gave the faintest shake of his head. "No, sir. Specifically, her estimate of job losses in the energy sector was exaggerated by around 38% compared to our federal baseline." The courtroom stirred. A few eyebrows lifted. A whisper floated from the gallery. Karoline didn't move, but the damage was being planted, one figure at a time. Richter stepped forward. "Would you say this misrepresentation could impact public understanding or policy discussions?" "Yes," Pratt said firmly. "The scale of the difference could distort public debate." That was the line they wanted, distort public debate. It was subtle but dangerous. But across the aisle, Karoline's defense lawyer stood up. He wasn't shaking, because he had Jasmine Crockett's playbook in his hand. She had prepared every line of questioning, every counterpoint, every citation. The folder in front of him was color-coded, tabbed, and backed by 3 weeks of midnight war room sessions with Jasmine. He didn't speak quickly. He didn't need to. "Mr. Pratt," he said calmly, "are you aware of which data sources Ms. Leavitt used for her projections?" Pratt paused. "No, I am not." "Could her numbers have come from regional or private sources? For example, the Tri-State Energy Coalition or the Northeast Labor Consortium?" Pratt shifted slightly. "It's possible. I didn't review those." "So just to clarify, you're not saying her numbers were fabricated, only that they differ from your department's national projections?" "That's correct," Pratt admitted. That was it. The seed of doubt had been reversed. Her data wasn't false. It was from a different model. Not criminal, contextual. Jasmine, sitting 2 seats away, gave the smallest nod. She had predicted this moment. She knew they'd go for the statistical misconduct angle, and she had loaded the defense with answers before the question was even asked. The attorney continued, "Do you have any proof, documents, emails, anything, that Ms. Leavitt knowingly used those numbers to deceive the public?" "No." "Any evidence she worked with advocacy groups to manipulate the data or sway the public intentionally?" "None." The air in the room changed. It didn't relax. It turned. The witness had nothing. The accusation had lost its sharp edge. The prosecution had hoped to paint Karoline as reckless with facts, but instead they had proven she cited real numbers from a different source. Karoline sat tall, wrists finely uncuffed, hands folded. She didn't speak, but her silence now felt very different from earlier. This time it didn't feel like she was being silenced. It felt like they were running out of things to say. Jasmine didn't look away from the stand. She didn't smile, but in her notes she underlined one word she had written days earlier in bold ink: diversion. They hadn't come to prove Karoline was guilty. They had come to distract from the fact that she was right. And now everyone in that courtroom could see it. The temperature in courtroom 3B hadn't risen. It had constricted. The numbers had failed to corner Karoline. Jasmine's preparation had dismantled the state's strategy with surgical precision. But Travers wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. When he adjusted his robe and leaned back, something in his posture changed. It wasn't the arrogance from earlier. It was subtler, more dangerous. The way a chess player leans back before sliding a pawn to bait the queen. The state, Richter said smoothly, calls Rachel Deming to the stand. Heads turned. A young woman stepped forward, pale, nervous, early 30s. She clutched a silver bracelet as she walked, her steps careful, her eyes darting toward the gallery. She wasn't a political figure. She wasn't a lawyer. She was a producer, the junior staffer from the television network that had hosted Karoline's February interview. Karoline's eyes narrowed. Jasmine didn't blink. The trap had just opened. Deming was sworn in. She adjusted the mic with shaking fingers. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost uncertain. "I was on set for Ms. Leavitt's interview," she said. "I coordinated camera angles and pre-show briefing." Richter nodded, hands folded behind his back like a school teacher walking a student toward a mistake. "Were you included in any pre-interview communication with Ms. Leavitt's team?" "Yes, I was copied on a few scheduling emails." "Did those emails include talking points or messaging documents?" Deming hesitated. Some included outline drafts from her communications director. "Did any of those drafts mention political strategy or cite input from outside advocacy organizations?" I don't think so. There were initials sometimes, but I couldn't tell where they came from." That was it. The shift. Karoline's expression didn't move, but her chest tightened. Jasmine, still silent, tapped her pen once against her binder, then slid a note forward to the defense attorney with calm, practiced speed. He opened it without question. It read only 4 words. "Stop this. Criminal framing." Richter's tone grew softer, smoother. "Ms. Deming, do you recall seeing the letters CUP or PAC in any email headers?" "I might have. I don't really know what those mean." "Did you forward any of those to legal?" "No, it didn't seem important at the time." "Do you understand what coordinated messaging is under federal election law?" No, not really." That was the moment. The room held its breath. Jasmine looked at the judge, not to ask, not to plead, but to warn. Her expression was controlled, but lethal. Karoline's defense attorney stood quickly. His voice was louder than it had been all day. "Objection. This line of questioning crosses into potential criminal coordination, which falls outside the scope of this hearing and is explicitly protected under the federal stay order issued this morning." Travers blinked, then leaned forward pretending to read from a paper that wasn't there. "Counselor," he said slowly, "the court is merely seeking clarity." "Clarity," Jasmine whispered under her breath, "is code for setup." The defense pushed harder. "This is prosecutorial entrapment disguised as inquiry. There is no admissible evidence, no formal accusation, and no jurisdiction for campaign finance speculation." Richter raised his hand slightly, like he was being misunderstood. "We're just establishing pattern," he said, voice low and reasonable. "We're not accusing." Jasmine tapped her pen twice. 2 beats. The lawyer turned to the judge. "If this line continues, we will seek immediate recess for injunctive clarification from the federal bench." Travers hesitated. His fingers drummed against the bench. He looked like a man who wanted to push further, but couldn't risk the fallout. Finally, through clenched teeth, he spoke. "Objection sustained. For now." Jasmine's expression didn't change, but the tide once again had turned, and Travers knew it. The courtroom exhaled, quietly. But Jasmine wasn't done. She knew Travers well enough to know he wouldn't retreat completely. He'd come again, and harder. She was right. 5 minutes later, Richter rose once more. "The state calls Julia Carnes, scheduling assistant for Citizens United PAC." There it was. The escalation. Deming had been a feeler. This was the strike. Karoline froze. Jasmine's head snapped up. Not fast, but sharp. Focused. Before the name was even echoed through the clerk's file, Jasmine stood. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were ice. "Your Honor, the defense objects to this witness. The individual is not relevant to the scope of these proceedings, introduces a political campaign component not previously disclosed, and represents a violation of the federal stay order." Travers didn't respond right away. He stared at Jasmine. She stared back. The courtroom sat in absolute stillness. This wasn't about words anymore. It was about authority, about who still owned the next 5 minutes. The court, he finally said, with a forced neutrality, will temporarily withhold testimony from this witness. Proceed with caution, counselor. That was as close to a surrender as he would give. Karoline exhaled softly. Jasmine returned to her seat without a single word. But everyone knew she had just blocked a fatal blow, not by yelling, not by pleading, by knowing the law better than the man abusing it. And somewhere, high above the courtroom, the federal judicial observer entered another note into his tablet. Attempted introduction of PAC witness. Blocked by defense. No legal foundation offered. Defense posture, exact. Response, successful. Jasmine didn't look up at the gallery. She didn't need to. She knew eyes were on her. Some stunned, some awed, some burning with the quiet question that had no answer yet. How do you beat a system that's designed to trap you? And the unspoken truth was written in every move Jasmine had made so far. You don't guess. You prepare. And when they shift the battlefield, you move first. The courtroom break had been called, but there was no break in the atmosphere. It wasn't relief. It was compression, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Judge Travers had left through the back again. The bailiff stepped away. The clerk leaned into quiet whispers with a staffer. Reporters typed without blinking. But in the far corner of the defense table, Jasmine Crockett was already moving. She didn't rush. Rushing was for amateurs. Jasmine moved like a professional in hostile territory. Her fingers slid a file into her leather case. She whispered something to Karoline's lawyer. Short, final. Then she stood, collected, and walked toward the rear exit of courtroom 3B. Not the main doors. Not the hallway lined with reporters and waiting attorneys. She took the narrow passage near the witness box, the kind only staff used. Up 2 flights, no guards, no noise. Just the echo of her heels on concrete steps and the hum of fluorescent lights. Jasmine reached the 4th floor. Judicial administration, no sign, no fanfare. Just a small brass plaque next to a frosted glass door that read, Clerk of Internal Review, confidential submissions only. She pushed it open. Inside was a reception area smaller than most closets. 1 desk, 1 scanner, 1 locked drop box. And behind the desk, a single staffer, gray sweater, glasses, expression unreadable. He looked up, registered her face, and didn't ask a single question. He just nodded. Jasmine placed a slim red envelope on the desk. The envelope wasn't thick, but its weight wasn't measured in pages. It was measured in consequences. She spoke quietly. No emotion. Ethics complaint, filed under judicial misconduct, emergency classification, immediate review requested. The staffer slid the envelope across a scanner, stamped it with a numbered seal, and placed it in the steel tray behind him. No small talk, no handshake, just procedure, cold, clean, and permanent. The form was short, 5 pages, but every word inside had been chosen with surgical intent. The front page listed the subject, Travers, Malcolm, Summit Heights Federal Court, docket 2024 CR 1109 inside. A signed affidavit from Jasmine citing procedural violations during the contempt ruling. A time-stamped transcript of Travers's order to detain Karoline, including the moment he overrode standard process. A certified audio recording captured by Jasmine's own device. Legal under federal rules, given she was a party of counsel. The voice was unmistakable. Travers barking the contempt order in direct contradiction to due process. A breakdown of at least 4 instances of bias. One-sided objections allowed, one-sided warnings issued, and evidence suppressed only from the defense. A federal court docket printout showing the emergency stay filed before Karoline's arrest, with Travers's actions time-stamped after. The final page was a legal summary, requesting emergency panel review, grounds for immediate administrative response, recommending temporary suspension pending inquiry. The clerk handed her a stamped copy of the submission receipt. Jasmine didn't look at it. She didn't thank him. She turned, heels sharp against tile, and walked out, the same way she came in. Quiet, cold, focused. Down the stairs, back into the noise of the courthouse. The moment she re-entered the main corridor, a staffer for the defense caught sight of her. But Jasmine held up a hand before he could speak. She wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Not until the fuse had been set. Back inside courtroom 3B, people were beginning to reassemble. Karoline was seated. Her wrists were now free, her blazer rebuttoned. But her eyes searched for Jasmine. The second she saw her returning through the side door, a question formed, but Jasmine gave a subtle shake of the head. Not here, not yet. She took her seat, opened her binder, didn't speak. But deep under the bench, Judge Travers had no idea that the ground beneath him had already shifted. He had walked out of that courtroom thinking he'd simply lost a round. He didn't know a complaint had already been filed, that a sealed envelope now sat inside a federal tray on the 4th floor, tagged for emergency review, that within hours a 3-person oversight panel would receive a notification, that his voice, the gavel, the authority, had been recorded and submitted as evidence of misconduct. Travers didn't know he was walking back into a room where his past 10 minutes had been turned into his own indictment. Above courtroom 3B, the Oversight Division's federal monitor tapped a new note into his tablet. Confirmed administrative filing against presiding judge. Subject unaware. Continue silent observation. And Jasmine, she didn't even look up. She knew this game too well. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's filed quietly while the judge thinks he's still in control. And sometimes that's the most powerful strike of all. The courtroom had filled again, but it wasn't the same room it had been an hour ago. Gone was the illusion of authority. Gone was the veneer of neutrality. What remained was a thin shell of formality, walls lined with people who had seen too much to pretend they were just observers anymore. The judge's bench sat like a spotlighted stage, and yet when Malcolm Travers returned, it wasn't with power. It was with performance. His steps were too slow, his eyes too careful. His voice, when it came, was polished but hollow. This court, he said, has reviewed the full record of testimony, exhibits, and procedural challenges brought forth during this hearing. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Karoline sat forward slightly, not out of tension, but readiness. The press in the back row had phones down and fingers poised. Everyone in the room could feel it. This wasn't justice being read, it was legacy damage control. Travers continued. In light of the evidence, this court finds that no deliberate misrepresentation occurred in the statements made by Ms. Leavitt regarding regional labor projections. He didn't say innocent. He didn't say cleared. He said nothing happened, like the past 2 days had just occurred without purpose or impact. Jasmine's expression didn't flicker, but Karoline's pulse surged. This court will therefore not pursue sanctions or disciplinary actions at this time. A wave of breath passed through the room, but no one exhaled fully. It felt like a setup. Too clean, too quiet. Jasmine glanced once at the transcript monitor. She could see it forming, the twist. Travers folded the sheet of paper before him, then opened a second, thinner, less official. However, he added, and there it was, this court must express concern regarding the tone and demeanor observed during Ms. Leavitt's testimony. Respect for courtroom procedure and judicial authority is essential to the integrity of this process. Silence, then stillness. The words were so carefully chosen. Not an accusation, not an order, but a scar, disguised as professionalism. Karoline's jaw locked. Jasmine didn't look at the bench. She rose calmly. Your Honor, she said, her voice low and controlled. As this court is aware, all commentary regarding conduct and tone during this proceeding is explicitly covered under the federal emergency stay issued at 9:42 a.m. Travers didn't respond. Jasmine took one step forward, eyes sharp. That stay was acknowledged and entered into the record. This remark violates the legal boundaries outlined by Judge Halverson's order. Still nothing. Travers kept his eyes on the paper. He didn't engage. He didn't defend. He retreated. He stood slowly, collecting his folders without meeting anyone's gaze. No final gavel, no handshake, no eye contact with the gallery, no applause. No courtroom staff moved to follow him. Even the bailiff turned away before he reached the chamber door. He walked out like a man who had once wielded a sword and now dragged it behind him, blunt and rusted. Karoline didn't speak. Jasmine sat back down like nothing had happened, but the energy in the room knew better. Something massive had shifted, and everyone had felt it. 3 days after the hearing, Summit Heights Courthouse looked almost unremarkable from the outside, just concrete and glass under a gray sky. But inside its administrative corridors, something was brewing. An official from the Federal Judicial Oversight Office quietly signed a confirmation slip. Complaint 22 FC-1119, filed by Jasmine Crockett, under preliminary review. No press, no cameras, no big statements. Yet that small stamp carried more force than any gavel slammed in courtroom 3B. Word slipped through the halls that a sensitive review was underway, though nobody dared speak Trevor's name in full. The staff recognized the hush that comes when someone powerful is about to face consequences. Clerks exchanged knowing looks, but they stuck to their task with careful deliberation. Secretaries pretended everything was business as usual, but you could sense the tension in the way they typed. It was the tension of a system forced, finally, to examine itself. Somewhere in the basement archives, a junior clerk cross-referenced the newly logged complaint, scanning for precedents involving contempt orders, procedural abuse, and suspected bias. The file was thin but potent. 5 pages of meticulously compiled evidence that Jasmine had assembled piece by piece, day by day, anticipating exactly how Trevor's might overreach. Attached were transcripts, audio timestamps, and references to federal procedural codes that even the veteran staffers recognized could topple a judge's career. There was no sensational headline, no public outcry, just the mechanical hum of a well-structured complaint slowly worming its way into the gears of the judiciary. And in those 3 days, Jasmine did not rush back and forth, demanding updates. She simply waited, confident in the avalanche she had quietly set in motion. Karoline, too, stayed silent. She declined interviews, brushed off invitations to speak on morning shows, and let the swirl of rumors pass around her without so much as a nod. And so the courthouse air grew thick with whispers, like the calm eye of a storm. On the 3rd day after the hearing, sometime around noon, the federal oversight officer filed his initial evaluation. The complaint was credible, he noted. The documented evidence suggested significant breaches of ethical conduct. In a sealed memo, he recommended further inquiry by a 3-judge panel, urging expedited proceedings to prevent further erosion of public trust. No press conference announced this development. No cameras lined the corridors. But the handful of insiders who learned the news felt the tremor beneath the marble floors. Far above, in a corner office, a senior administrative judge skimmed the complaint. His eyes flicked over the paragraphs detailing Trevor's repeated interruptions, the unilateral arrest order, and the final, thinly veiled jab at Karoline's decorum. He paused at the mention of Jasmine Crockett and her multiple references to the federal stay. He signed off on the next step, and the machinery began to churn. Karoline continued her normal routine. She flew back to New Hampshire, visited local nonprofits, and offered policy advice to struggling small businesses. Cameras hovered around her from a distance, hoping she would speak about the hearing or gloat over her victory. But she offered no sound bites, no boasts, no self-praise. In quiet town halls, she addressed issues of employment, inflation, and infrastructure, never once mentioning Judge Trevor's or that infamous day in courtroom 3B. Reporters sometimes cornered her, pressing for a statement, but her answer was always the same. I have nothing to add beyond the public record. It drove the media insane, as they craved drama, scandal, a big headline about a toppled judge. They couldn't understand why she didn't capitalize on the momentum. To Karoline, there was no triumph in humiliating someone, only in letting the truth breathe on its own. And if the system was righting itself, she believed it should do so without her grandstanding. Jasmine, however, remained in Washington, D.C., juggling several other high-profile cases while keeping a discreet watch on the progress of her complaint. She communicated only in formal memos to the Oversight Office, never once leaking the case details to the press. She understood that a quiet, methodical approach was more potent than front-page sensationalism. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, her colleagues asked if she planned to take down every judge who abused power. She would smile, a small, almost tired smile, and reply, "One at a time, if that's what it takes." There was no triumph in her tone, just purpose. Jasmine believed in the law like a craftsman believes in his tools. It had to be wielded with precision. She had no time for gloating, because gloating didn't fix the system. All that mattered was ensuring that this complaint led to meaningful consequences. 2 weeks slipped by. The complaint remained sealed from public view, but inside the federal judiciary, it moved quickly, like a quiet serpent slithering through corridors of power. Then, late on a Thursday afternoon, a single-page memo arrived on the desk of the chief clerk at Summit Heights. Judge Malcolm Travers had resigned, effective immediately. No press release, no press conference, no farewells or official statements. He simply walked into his chambers, drafted a half-page letter citing personal reasons, and handed it in. By dusk, word had spread to the entire courthouse staff that Travers was gone. The effect was eerie, a sudden vacuum in the place of a man who had once run his court with an iron grip. Journalists scrambled to get a comment from Karoline. They waited outside her New Hampshire office, called her staff relentlessly, and even tried ambushing her at a community event. Yet she said nothing. Not a celebratory word, not a shred of vindication. She simply stated she had no comment on personnel matters within the federal judiciary. Some found her refusal to celebrate perplexing, even disappointing. They wanted a victory dance, a statement about justice served. Instead, they got a calm, polite silence from a woman who had decided that it was enough to let the record speak for itself. In the days following Travers' resignation, speculation swirled. Some believed he fled to avoid a full investigation. Others claimed he might reappear in private practice. Rumors spread that high-level officials had quietly advised him to bow out before the formal ethics hearing could begin. Still, no one from the judiciary would comment, citing confidentiality. Under normal circumstances, this kind of abrupt departure might trigger a media frenzy, with pundits dissecting every angle. But Karoline's stoic response left little room for sensational spin. Without a protagonist crowing victory or an antagonist lashing out, the story lost its heat in the national spotlight. People wanted drama and public takedowns, but they found only measured statements and sealed documents. Meanwhile, the Federal Oversight Division neither confirmed nor denied the complaint's role in Travers' exit. It was a quiet, surgical resolution. 3 days after Travers' resignation, Jasmine Crockett sat in her D.C. office, finalizing briefs for another case, when an email pinged her inbox. The subject line read, Complaint 22 FC-1119, Review Status. She opened it, scanning the official language with the same methodical detachment she'd used to build the file in the first place. The message was concise. Matter concluded. No further response required. There was no explanation, no listing of findings, no grand pronouncement of victory. Just a bureaucratic end to a bureaucratic act. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't pump her fist in triumph. She only forwarded the email to Karoline's legal team with a single-word subject, finishes. It was the most anticlimactic finale the media could imagine. No fireworks, no press statements, no courtroom confessions. Yet it held a certain power, a subtle justice that didn't depend on fanfare. For Karoline, it meant closure without shouting. For Jasmine, it affirmed that a well-timed complaint could unravel a judge's career more effectively than any heated confrontation on camera. For Travers, it meant disappearing into obscurity, leaving behind a legacy stained by overreach. And for everyone who had witnessed the hearing, it meant the system, flawed though it was, had found a way to correct itself without indulging in spectacle. In a world addicted to loud headlines, the silence resonated louder than any victory speech. Reporters, hungry for a final comment, tried to corner Jasmine in the courthouse lobby 2 days later. She paused, gave them a moment of her time, and delivered a precise statement. All I can say is the law worked the way it should. The cameras flashed, recorders beeped, but she offered nothing more. When pressed for details, she repeated the same line. It's a closed matter. One journalist challenged her, claiming the public deserved a deeper explanation. She replied calmly, The court spoke. The record stands. I have no interest in relitigating what was settled behind sealed doors. That answer, as unfulfilling as it was for the news cycle, drew a quiet applause from a few staffers standing nearby. Even they understood that sometimes victory is in the structure, not the show. The reporters left with half-empty notebooks, a mixture of frustration and respect on their faces. Karoline's phone never stopped buzzing. Offers to appear on high-profile news programs, invitations to speak at political conventions, requests for quotes to fill the primetime loop. She politely declined all of them. Each time she repeated the same measured words. I've said all I need to say. Her aides, at first perplexed, grew to admire her restraint. They watched how constituents responded. People who'd been let down by flashy politicians found Karoline's quiet certainty refreshing. Some called it humility, others called it strategy. But Karoline insisted it was simply letting justice stand on its own 2 feet. She would not become a celebrity off the back of an unjust system correcting itself. Behind the scenes, a few political insiders speculated about Jasmine's future. Would she run for office? Would she be nominated to a bench herself? Rumors floated around Capitol Hill that she was on shortlists for high-ranking legal positions. Yet Jasmine showed no public interest in shifting her career away from the trenches. She continued representing clients in complex litigation, quietly navigating the corridors of federal courts, untempted by headlines or grandstanding. If anyone asked about her ambitions, she simply said, "There's too much work to be done right where I am." She never mentioned Trevor's name, never bragged about pushing a judge into resignation, because that wasn't the point for her. The point was, the law served precisely and without theatrics. In the weeks that followed, life moved on. Summit Heights assigned a new judge, cautious, young, but apparently eager to avoid the pitfalls of his predecessor. Karoline focused on her policy work, championing labor statistics and regional job growth like she had before this entire ordeal. People no longer questioned her credibility. If anything, they found her more credible than ever. Jasmine kept a watchful distance, prepared to re-engage if any fresh injustice emerged. The federal complaint remained sealed, locked in archived records, a silent testament to how a small, precise action can dismantle someone who believed himself untouchable. In the end, there were no fireworks, no victory parades, no tearful press conferences, just a line in the docket. Complaint 22FC-1119, resolved. And that word was enough to close a chapter that began in anger, but ended in quiet accountability. Sometimes real power is found in the absence of noise. The neon sign outside Bill's Roadhouse flickered against the twilight sky, casting intermittent red and blue glows on the frosted parking lot. Inside, the place smelled of worn leather stools, stale peanuts, and something fried lingering in the air. At a corner table sat 2 men, both on the far side of middle age, each nursing a half-empty beer. One was a former Army sergeant with a stiff spine and a gravelly voice. The other was a retired truck driver who still wore his old company cap, frayed at the edges. A small TV above the bar played muted reruns of local news. But neither man paid attention to that. Their eyes were locked on a tablet propped up between them, a shaky video clip from the now infamous Summit Heights courthouse hearing. They watched mesmerized as Jasmine Crockett calmly rose to shut down a judge's bullying attempts, never once raising her voice. The older soldier's weathered hands tightened around his beer glass whenever he saw Karoline Leavitt in handcuffs. A hush settled between them, like they were seeing justice and injustice collide all at once. The ex-sergeant's name was Greg. He'd done 2 tours overseas, lost a few good friends to roadside bombs, and spent the last decade trying to forget the look of men who abused power just because they could. The trucker was Hank, a man who'd driven 18-wheelers across all 48 contiguous states, witnessing all sorts of human dramas through his windshield. They'd known each other long enough to share stories of heartbreak, wars, divorces, and the 1,000 ways America could test a man's spirit. Tonight, though, their conversation was about Karoline, Jasmine, and a judge who thought a courtroom was his personal fiefdom. Hank tapped the screen to pause the video at the precise moment Jasmine handed the sealed document to the clerk. "God," he muttered, "look at her face, like she's already won." Greg leaned in, seeing the steeled resolve in Jasmine's eyes. That's because she knew the rules better than he did, Greg said quietly. And in that moment, the tension in their own hearts seemed to mirror the tension on screen. They let the video play again, the volume low so the bartender wouldn't catch wind of the legal war they were replaying. Every time Karoline spoke, you could see how the judge tried to undermine her, cutting her off, threatening contempt, making a mockery of due process. Hank shook his head slowly, his knuckles white around his glass. "This is the same crap you see out on the road sometimes," he said. "Cops pulling you over, treating you like dirt, just 'cause they can." Greg didn't disagree. He remembered an incident on base where a commanding officer had humiliated a young private for insubordination, even though the soldier was just telling the truth. That same sickness was all over Judge Trevor's face. This arrogance that demanded submission, not justice. And yet here was Jasmine, leveling the field with nothing but a quiet voice and a binder of meticulously prepared evidence. They reached the part where Karoline got cuffed, an image that played out like a slow-motion car crash. The judge's order echoed through the tinny speaker. "Take her into custody." Hank could practically feel his blood pressure spike. Greg let out a breath. "Seen that look before?" he murmured, remembering young recruits forced to drop for push-ups in the mud for no reason other than power posturing. But as they watched Karoline walk off the stand, hands behind her back, Hank noticed something. She didn't break. Her shoulders didn't slump. Her voice didn't tremble. "That's what real courage looks like," Hank muttered. Greg nodded in solemn agreement, eyes fixed on the screen like it was a battlefield scene. And as the video continued, they saw Jasmine's calm intervention, handing over the emergency stay, outmaneuvering a man who believed himself invincible. They replayed that moment 3 or 4 times, studying the expression on Judge Trevor's face. It was like watching a lion realize the hunter's rifle was already aimed. "You can almost see the panic in his eyes," Greg whispered, leaning forward so intensely he nearly spilled his beer. "He never expected to be outsmarted," Hank added. They paused again, analyzing how the bailiff's hands shook, how the clerk's eyes widened upon reading the judge's contradictory stance. Another round of muted curses slipped out. Greg cursing the system that allowed men like Trevor's to hold so much unchecked authority. Hank cursing the luck that put Karoline in that seat in the first place. Yet the more they watched, the more they realized Karoline wasn't helpless. She had Jasmine, and Jasmine had the law. "Victory doesn't come from shouting," Hank finally said, quoting one of Karoline's interviews he'd read about. "It comes from understanding the law and being ready to use it." Greg nodded, swallowing hard as if the truth of that statement tasted bittersweet. At one point, the bartender glanced over, curiosity getting the better of him. "Fellas, you watching a new action flick?" he asked, half joking. Hank just shook his head. "Real life, friend," he said, closing the conversation before it began. The bartender shrugged and went back to wiping glasses, leaving the 2 men in their tight circle of focus. They resumed the clip, now at the part where the hearing had paused for Trevor's to review the emergency stay. In the bar's dim lighting, the glow from the tablet illuminated Greg's weathered face. You could see that he understood every dimension of a rigged system. The commanding officer who wanted to break you, the judge who wanted to silence you, the corporate boss who thrived on fear. Hank tapped the screen to fast forward to the moment the session resumed, where Karoline was no longer cuffed, but the prosecution tried a new tactic. It was like watching a snake change skins, one manipulation replaced by another. The men paused at a frame where Jasmine whispered something to Karoline, presumably advising her on the next moves. Hank's jaw clenched. "You think she saw it all coming?" he asked. Greg answered without hesitation. "She didn't guess." She prepared that line echoed a statement from earlier in the video, and it sank into the space between them like a profound revelation. They both knew the difference. Guessing meant hoping you'd be right. Preparing meant making sure you were right. It reminded Greg of the times he'd meticulously planned a convoy route, double-checking every detail so no one got ambushed. It reminded Hank of the cross-country hauls where you had to plan rest stops, way stations, and traffic patterns to avoid catastrophe. "That's how you stay ahead of the game," Hank said, tapping the old cap on his head. "You do your homework." Greg let out a slow, thoughtful exhale, acknowledging that sometimes homework was the only armor people had against a broken system. Near the end of the footage, Judge Travers read out the final verdict. No evidence of wrongdoing, no sanctions against Karoline. But then slipped in that patronizing line about her tone. Hank swore under his breath. "What a cheap shot," Greg growled. They watched Karoline's reaction. No rage, no tears, just a quiet resolution that said she wouldn't be dragged into a last-minute fight. And then Jasmine stood, calmly pointing out how that remark fell outside the allowed scope. You could almost see Travers shrinking behind his own bench, refusing to answer, then slinking out the back like a wounded animal. The men replayed that exit 3 times, gleaning every second of the judge's bruised pride. The sense of relief was palpable, but overshadowed by the injustice Karoline had endured. She shouldn't have had to face that in the first place, Hank muttered. Greg silently agreed, finishing his beer with a grim set to his jaw. Over the next hour, they dissected every angle, how the system had tried to bury Karoline, how Jasmine's preparation turned the tables, and how the final insult from Travers exposed his real character. Their conversation swung from frustration to admiration, from cynicism to a spark of hope. Hank started talking about the times he'd been pulled over on false pretense, times no one believed him because the uniform told a different story. Greg recalled how a colonel once threatened to demote him for filing a harassment complaint. These personal scars made them appreciate Karoline's ordeal on a deeper level. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for anyone who'd been dismissed under the banner of decorum. The men raised their fresh beers in a muted toast to Karoline's grit and Jasmine's skill. "Still can't believe she didn't want the spotlight after all that," Hank said, shaking his head. Greg responded quietly, "She doesn't need the spotlight. She's got the truth." And in that exchange, they found a strange solace, recognizing that real heroes often move on without fanfare. A televised sports highlight cut through the bar's silence for a moment. A quarterback sacked at the 10-yard line. The bartender turned the volume up briefly, but Greg and Hank barely glanced at the screen. Their minds were still back in that courtroom, replaying every detail, every injustice. The cyclical hum of a neon sign and the distant blare of traffic outside seemed to underscore the tension still crackling in their veins. Hank set his glass down harder than he intended, rattling the ashtray. "You know," he said, voice rough, "if I ever end up in a court, I'd want someone like Jasmine on my side, calm but lethal." Greg half smiled, though there was sorrow in it. "They're rare," he said, "too rare. But that's what it takes to stand up to a rigged system." Hank nodded, letting the unsaid question hover. What if more people stood up like that? Eventually, Greg pulled up the final snippet of the hearing, a shaky phone recording from someone in the gallery capturing Jasmine's last words to Karoline. You could barely hear them. "He just made his first mistake," echoing right after the judge tried to have Karoline cuffed. Hank watched it, and a grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Man, that's something," he said softly. Greg nodded. "It's not the roar that matters. It's knowing exactly where and when to strike." The men fell quiet again. Each had faced bullies, uniformed or otherwise, and each had their own regrets about not always having the right strategy in time. But here, they witnessed a woman who had the strategy ready before the fight began. It reminded them that battles aren't always won by muscle or loudness. Sometimes they're won in the quiet hours of preparation, the nights spent reading statutes, drafting motions, and forging alliances in the shadows. Sometimes those battles are the most decisive of all. As the night wore on, Hank and Greg realized how late it had become. The bartender had wiped down the counter twice, a polite hint that closing time was near. They finished their beers, letting the last of the stale peanuts tumble across the tabletop. Then, almost in unison, they stood. Hank closed the tablet, carefully placing it in his coat pocket. Greg looked around the bar, feeling the final hush settle over the place, like the resolution of a good story. No fireworks, no victory parade, just an understanding that something important had happened. "Victory doesn't come from shouting," Hank repeated, more to himself than to anyone else. "It comes from knowing the law and being ready every step of the way." Greg let out a long breath, touched the brim of his hat, and answered quietly, "Amen to that." They stepped outside into the cold New Hampshire night, the parking lot illuminated by a single, flickering street lamp. A faint smell of pine mingled with the crisp air, each breath visibly escaping their mouths like thin clouds. Hank zipped up his jacket against the chill, while Greg paused to light a cigarette. The faint glow of the lighter danced across the lines of his face, revealing a tired but determined expression. "Let's hope we see more folks like Jasmine," Hank said, rubbing his gloved hands together. Greg took a slow drag, nodding solemnly. "Yeah," he replied, exhaling a thin plume of smoke. "People who don't flinch when the system tries to shut them down." A moment of silence passed between them, the kind that spoke volumes. They both knew the world needed more quiet warriors, not more loud talkers. In the distance, the low hum of passing cars broke the stillness, headlights sweeping across the asphalt. Hank unlocked his pickup truck, an old silver beast with a squeaky door, and Greg walked him there. Before climbing inside, Hank glanced at his friend. "You think Karoline's okay after all that?" he asked softly. Greg shrugged. "She's tough, sure, but no one walks away unscathed from that kind of ordeal." Hank nodded, remembering the tension on her face when she was cuffed. "At least she had Jasmine," he added. Greg took another puff, the end of his cigarette flaring bright. "That's right, and now the country's seen what real courage, backed by preparation, can do." Hank closed the door, started the engine, and gave Greg a final salute through the window. Greg turned toward his own SUV, footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. He paused for a second, gazed lingering on the empty highway stretching beyond the bar. In the stale light of the neon sign, he thought about how many times he'd seen powerful men crush honest voices. But tonight was different. Tonight he'd seen that honesty fight back, quietly but decisively, and it gave him a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. He crushed the cigarette underfoot, recalling Hank's words. "Victory doesn't come from shouting. It comes from understanding the law and being prepared." That line echoed in his mind, weaving itself into the memories of every injustice he'd witnessed. He opened the driver's side door, the chilly wind biting at his cheeks, but inside he felt warmed by something intangible. "Good night, Bill's Roadhouse," he murmured, as if saying goodbye to the last vestiges of doubt. He slid in behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled away, carrying that newfound belief into the darkness ahead. As the two men drove off in separate directions, the bar lights faded behind them, leaving only the hum of tires on asphalt. In a way, they were leaving behind more than a building. They were leaving behind the cynicism that once told them the system was unbeatable. They'd watch Karoline stand up, watch Jasmine plan every angle, and realize that sometimes the quiet route is the strongest. No parades, no confetti, just a series of well-placed legal moves that cornered a bully in a robe. The roads were dark, lined by tall pines that rustled in the winter wind, and each man reflected on what he'd learned. Maybe, just maybe, courage didn't have to roar to be heard. Maybe it thrived in the spaces where the gavel struck silence, and the only defense was knowledge, readiness, and a refusal to yield. If more people understood that, the world could shift, one quiet victory at a time. They drove on, the glow of their taillights disappearing into the long night. But the lesson of that courthouse showdown remained, shining like a beacon in their minds. The law appears fragile, battered by those who crave power and control. But even a gavel cannot silence a voice armed with truth. When strategy meets courage, the system's cracks reveal a path. No riots, no rebellion, only meticulous filings and resolve turn the tide. Like a fuse, legal precision ignites change without violence. Each motion, each well-timed objection, becomes a hammer striking crooked walls. Before long, those who once ruled from pedestals see their power erode. Truth stands taller than any gavel, enforcing what should never have broken. Justice needs no trumpets, only those who demand the law obey itself. In just 5 minutes, a powerful judge tried to silence Jasmine Crockett with a $15,000 fine. No evidence, no hearing, just power abused. But what he didn't expect was that this very moment would push him to the brink of his own downfall. What was supposed to be a routine procedural hearing exploded into a breathless battle between arrogance and justice. Can a black woman armed only with law and courage bring an entire system to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was a cold, gray morning in downtown Chicago. Courtroom 2A was scheduled for a minor procedural hearing, just a quick check on paperwork. But the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. Jasmine, a seasoned lawyer and former prosecutor, had seen enough to sense when a room was rigged. The silence was too deep. The court staff avoided eye contact. Even the walls felt like they were listening. Judge Richard Monroe was already seated, tall, stern, and known for pushing verdicts through without hearing full arguments. He didn't read files. He delivered sentences. His cold stare followed Jasmine as she walked in. He didn't look at her like a lawyer. He looked at her like an obstacle. The courtroom felt like a trap, and Jasmine was walking straight into it. Everyone could feel it. The air wasn't just tense, it was controlled. The judge wasn't there for justice. He was there for power. Judge Monroe entered with a presence that sucked the air out of the room. He didn't pause. He didn't greet the court. He didn't glance at the counsel tables. He simply sat, adjusted his robe with one sharp tug, and then looked straight ahead, eyes cold and flat. His voice came next, low, clipped, and without hesitation. This matter is already clear. The defendant is in violation of Code 22F. The fine is $15,000 to be paid immediately. That is the court's decision. No buildup, no explanation, no process, just a blunt declaration, as if the case had already been tried and buried long before the doors even opened. Jasmine hadn't spoken a word. Her files were still closed. Her hands, resting calmly on the table just moments earlier, now curled slightly, controlled, but tense. Across the room, even the prosecutor looked up in confusion, brows furrowed, shifting in his seat like he'd missed something crucial. He hadn't. Everyone had, because there hadn't been anything to miss. No arguments, no evidence, not even the usual procedural opening. Just a ruling, final, cold, irrevocable. It was a legal firing squad, and Jasmine was expected to nod, accept it, and walk away wounded. She didn't. But first she tried to understand. "Your Honor," she said carefully, rising just halfway from her seat. "With all respect, we haven't even begun. I haven't presented a single argument." Monroe's eyes narrowed, not with reconsideration, but with irritation. "Because none are needed," he snapped. "You violated the code. It's not up for debate." His tone wasn't simply dismissive. It was biting, deliberate, meant to humiliate. This wasn't a misunderstanding of the law. It was a calculated message. Sit down, be quiet. Don't challenge this court. Jasmine didn't react the way most people would in that moment. No raised voice, no visible frustration. She remained standing, her hands calmly folded in front of her, every movement precise, controlled. Her heart might have been pounding beneath her tailored blazer, but on the outside, she was unshakable. That control wasn't just instinct, it was training. Years as a prosecutor had taught her that in a courtroom where power is misused, restraint is the sharpest weapon. She took a breath, then spoke with clarity and purpose. "Your Honor, with full respect, I am formally requesting the opportunity to present my defense. Due process requires that I be heard." Her voice cut through the silence, not loud, but unmistakably firm. Her words carried not just legal authority, but moral weight. She wasn't asking. She was invoking a right. But Monroe didn't flinch. He didn't even pretend to consider her request. He looked straight at her now, but not with fairness. His eyes narrowed, jaw locked, as if her mere words had offended him. He leaned forward, both elbows on the bench, and said louder this time, "Miss Crockett, this is not your stage. This is my courtroom, and I will not entertain speeches or stall tactics." The words cracked like a whip across the room. "The violation is on record. The fine is final. You want to argue? Take it to appeals, if it gets that far." His tone was sharp, final, and laced with contempt. Not legal skepticism, personal contempt, the kind that turns rulings into punishments and punishments into warnings for everyone watching. The courtroom had become a theater of intimidation, and Jasmine was the target. She didn't move. She stood like a statue under pressure. But inside her mind, everything accelerated. Fast. Focused. This wasn't legal procedure. It was an execution of control. Monroe wasn't upholding the law. He was using the bench as a throne. His voice, his posture, his refusal to even let her speak. It all pointed to one truth. He had already made up his mind, and nothing she said would change it. But it wasn't just about her case. It was about silencing her in front of everyone. To make an example, to remind every attorney, every clerk, every citizen watching from the gallery, you challenge me, and I will crush you, openly, without hesitation. Jasmine could feel it. This wasn't about the code violation anymore. It was about her presence, her confidence, her unwillingness to play submissive. Monroe wasn't reacting to law. He was reacting to her power, her voice, and now he was trying to strip it from her, one ruling at a time. The prosecutor avoided eye contact. The court reporter had paused her fingers. The room wasn't neutral anymore. It had turned hostile. And yet, in that silence, Jasmine found clarity. Monroe had made one thing absolutely clear. He never planned to give her a fair hearing. He didn't come to listen. He came to dominate. Still, she didn't sit. She didn't fold. Her voice was lower now, but stronger. Then I suppose, she said, eyes locked on his, we proceed on the record. Every word, every step. Because if the law wouldn't protect her today, the truth would. And every injustice needs a witness. And that was when Jasmine made her move. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous to a man like Judge Monroe. Clarity. She had watched enough by then to understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't haste. This was surgical suppression. She wasn't being fined for a code violation. She was being silenced for who she was, for the strength in her voice and the refusal in her posture. Everything in Monroe's courtroom had been arranged to deliver a message. You don't belong here. You may know the law, but I own the bench. He had the gavel. But Jasmine had something heavier, precedent. And as she reached into her folder, the shift in the room was almost audible. The quiet wasn't respect anymore. It was anticipation. The kind of stillness before the first domino falls. She laid out the documents on the desk in front of her, like pieces to a machine only she knew how to operate. Each page had been chosen, marked, and rehearsed for exactly this moment. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, sharp, we're about to talk precedent because what you're doing has already been judged, and it didn't hold up. She raised the first page. Sullivan v. State of Illinois, 2017. The defendant was fined under a local enforcement code. No photos, no inspection reports, no affidavit, just the officer's claim. That case went to appeal. The court found the process unconstitutional and reversed the fine in full. She let it sit for a moment, then continued. In its written opinion, the appellate court stated, quote, where there is no evidence, there is no enforcement. The integrity of due process demands more than assumption. Her tone never changed. She wasn't trying to perform. She was building pressure, line by line, statute by statute. She flipped the second page. Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg, 2019. An officer issued a fine based on a visual assessment. No photos, no timestamps, no physical record. City argued it was standard practice. The court disagreed. In its ruling, it stated, administrative authority does not exist in a vacuum. Fines must be based on verifiable fact, or they are void under constitutional review. She looked up slowly, locking eyes with Monroe. That ruling was upheld at every level, and that was the first time Monroe shifted. It was small, a tightening of the jaw, a slight adjustment of his shoulders, but Jasmine caught it. So did the others. The clerk's typing resumed, almost with urgency now. The prosecutor uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, hands clasped, suddenly more spectator than participant. Jasmine leaned in too, not physically, but rhetorically. You fined me $15,000, she said, without requesting evidence, without allowing argument, without even opening the hearing. Her voice hardened, not louder, just sharper. There is no documentation, no testimony, just your word. And respectfully, Your Honor, that is not justice. That is authoritarianism in judicial robes. A subtle wave of discomfort moved through the gallery. Attorneys in the back exchanged quick glances, as if silently asking each other, "Is she really saying this?" She was, and she wasn't finished. Jasmine tapped her file one more time. "I bring these cases not as theory, but as binding reminders of what this courtroom is supposed to represent. When a judge ignores process, silences defense, and rules without proof, they are not interpreting the law, they are violating it. And I won't let that happen quietly." She stood still, eyes locked on Monroe, her voice lowered to almost a whisper, but it carried like thunder. "You can ignore my argument, but you can't erase precedent, and you will not rewrite the Constitution from behind that bench." Judge Monroe didn't blink at first, but Jasmine noticed the shift. His jaw tightened. His eyes lost their sharp focus for half a second, darting toward the clerk, then toward the prosecution table. His fingers, once calmly resting on the bench, began to tap a slow, uneven rhythm. He was calculating, hard. Every move he'd made up to this point had been built on control, on intimidation, on the assumption that Jasmine would either back down or crack under pressure. But now the foundation he stood on had started to fracture. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She had done it with surgical precision, citing appellate rulings and constitutional language he could not dismiss, without making a mockery of the very legal system he claimed to uphold. And that terrified him more than anger ever could. His voice, when it finally came, had lost its earlier bite. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he said abruptly, then stood. No explanation, no acknowledgement, no eye contact. It was an escape disguised as procedure, a retreat hidden behind decorum. The bailiff moved quickly, opening the door to chambers as Monroe disappeared behind it, his robe trailing like a shield he was no longer confident in carrying. But Jasmine knew exactly what had just happened. That wasn't a break to consider evidence. That was a tactical withdrawal, a pause to strategize, to call someone, to dig for anything he could use to discredit her, derail her, or delay the inevitable. Because now he wasn't just facing a lawyer, he was facing accountability. The courtroom for a moment remained still, as if unsure whether it had permission to breathe again. The clerk looked visibly unsettled, eyes flickering toward Jasmine, but never fully meeting her gaze. The prosecutor sat stone-faced, but his fingers fidgeted nervously in his lap. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't move. She remained standing, her back straight, her hands still resting gently on the stack of precedents she had just unloaded like live ammunition. She wasn't looking for applause. She was reading the room, and what she saw was exactly what Monroe feared. Doubt. Doubt creeping into the cracks of his authority. Doubt rippling across every silent observer who had just witnessed what few ever dared to say aloud in a courtroom. That even a judge could be wrong. Even a judge could be cornered. 15 minutes. That was all he'd asked for. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't 15 minutes of reflection. It was 15 minutes to save himself. He would try to rewrite his strategy, shift the narrative, maybe even bring in reinforcements. Because the only thing more dangerous than a well-prepared attorney is one who is fearless, grounded in truth, and unwilling to yield under pressure. Jasmine had just stepped across a line that most never dared approach. She didn't just demand fairness. She forced the court to confront its own imbalance. And Monroe, for all his years on the bench, had no playbook for that. As the clock ticked on and the room settled into a fragile, uncertain quiet, Jasmine remained still, ready, focused, and unshaken. The judge had left to search for higher ground, but she wasn't going anywhere. Not until every inch of that courtroom remembered what it meant to stand for justice. When the door to the judge's chambers finally opened, all eyes turned, and then narrowed with confusion. Judge Monroe re-entered, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a second figure, taller, older, with a gait that radiated institutional gravity. Judge Thomas Whitaker. His black robe seemed heavier than Monroe's, the fabric moving with the kind of deliberate weight only earned through decades of federal bench power. The room shifted instantly. It wasn't just about another body in the courtroom. It was about what his presence implied. A low murmur swept through the gallery, not of curiosity, but of unease. Even the court officer stood taller, straighter, as if suddenly realizing this case had graduated from routine to something far more combustible. Jasmine didn't need anyone to tell her what this meant. You don't summon Judge Whitaker into a hearing like this unless something is spiraling, and Monroe, for all his arrogance, had finally felt the rope tightening. Monroe returned to the bench, his voice stripped of the dominance it carried earlier. "For the record," he said, clearing his throat, "I have invited Judge Whitaker to observe and, if necessary, provide guidance on certain procedural questions that have arisen." It was a carefully crafted statement, one meant to sound procedural, impartial, routine. But everyone in that room could hear the truth buried underneath. He was losing control, and now he needed someone with more authority to anchor the ship before it capsized. Monroe didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't, not after the precision with which she dismantled his earlier ruling. Instead, he leaned back, almost disappearing into his chair, letting Whitaker's presence fill the space he could no longer command. Jasmine stood calmly, but her senses were on high alert. She had read about Whitaker, a former appellate judge turned senior federal overseer, known for his intellect, his ruthlessness in cross-review, and his iron sense of courtroom order. He wasn't the type to shout. He didn't need to. One look from him was often more effective than 100 objections. And now that gaze landed on Jasmine, not with hostility, but with razor-sharp scrutiny. He was assessing her, not just her words, but her posture, her breath, the cadence of her silence. And Jasmine knew what this meant. She was no longer just defending herself from a biased ruling. She was standing trial in front of the system itself. She didn't waver. She met his gaze, 1 second longer than necessary, her chin lifted, her presence anchored. She wasn't intimidated, but she was aware. This wasn't just a courtroom now. It was a battlefield of legacy versus reform, of entitlement versus earned credibility. Monroe had brought in Whitaker hoping to tip the scales, to outrank her voice with hierarchy. But Jasmine had something neither robe could override: precedent, constitutional grounding, and an undeniable record of being right. This wasn't just a legal defense anymore. It was a challenge to the hierarchy that had allowed Monroe to operate unchecked for years. Whitaker adjusted his robe, glanced down at the case file on the bench, and finally spoke. His voice was even, deliberate, but unmistakably commanding. "Miss Crockett," he said, "you've raised several constitutional concerns regarding the enforcement of Code 22F. I would like you to restate your core argument for the record." It wasn't a request, it was a test, a live audit, and Jasmine understood. She had walked into a rigged courtroom, dismantled the trap, and now had to defend her truth under federal spotlight. One misstep and everything could collapse. But one precise word, and she would not only survive this room, she'd own it. And so, without looking down, without hesitation, she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I'll begin with the due process failures, supported by appellate precedent." Her voice didn't just respond, it declared. The rules had changed, the power had shifted, and Monroe knew it. Whitaker was here to weigh the law. But the courtroom? It was already leaning toward Jasmine. The courtroom had settled into a cold, humming quiet. Jasmine stood at the defense table, her hand lightly resting on the leather edge of her folder. She didn't move as the bailiff called, "Officer Nathan Ellis to the stand." From the back of the room, a man rose with the stiff posture of someone who believed he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His navy blue uniform was spotless, his badge gleaming like it had just been polished for this moment. He walked with the kind of confidence that comes from 2 decades of never being challenged. That was about to change. Jasmine watched him with surgical stillness. Ellis didn't look at her. He looked straight ahead, like a man checking off a form he'd filled out 100 times. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right, and repeated the oath. Then he sat down, folded his hands, and waited. Like he already knew how this would end. Jasmine took 3 slow steps toward the witness box. Not rushed, not dramatic. Just enough to let him, and everyone watching, feel the weight of what was coming. "Officer Ellis," she began, her tone calm, not confrontational. "You issued the citation that resulted in the fine against me, correct?" Yes, ma'am, he replied easily, almost too casually. And that citation was based on a violation you claim to have observed? That's right. She nodded slightly. Let's break that down. Did you document the alleged violation with any photographs? No, ma'am, he said, shaking his head. Didn't need to. Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room dropped. Did you write a detailed incident report? No. No diagram. No witness affidavit? No time-stamped image from a city camera? None required, Ellis replied with a small shrug. Was there anyone else present at the time of the alleged violation? Number one was alone. Jasmine paused for one full second. Then she turned slightly toward the gallery and the bench. Her words were slow, deliberate. So to be clear, you issued a fine for $15,000 based entirely on your personal judgment, with no photographic evidence, no written report, no third-party verification, and no supporting documentation? Yes, he said again, this time with a touch of irritation. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know what a violation looks like. There it was. The moment of arrogance. The assumption that experience equals immunity. Jasmine's lips curled into a faint smile. Controlled. Calculated. I'm sure you do, officer, she said, her tone velvet with just the slightest edge of steel. But we're not here to debate your instincts. We're here to talk about evidence. Ellis shifted. It wasn't a large movement, but it was enough. The confidence, so firm a minute ago, now had a crack. She took a small step closer. Do you believe that your personal opinion, without supporting evidence, is enough to override the due process rights of a citizen in a federal court? His brow furrowed. I believe my experience gives me the ability to make sound judgments in the field. Judgments, yes, Jasmine said, her voice cooling. But fines? Penalties? Legal consequences that carry weight under the Constitution? She turned back to the bench. Your Honors, what we have here is not enforcement. It's assumption. Not process, it's projection. Officer Ellis didn't observe a crime. He interpreted one and then treated that interpretation as law. She returned her eyes to Ellis. Can you point to anything in the citation file? Anything that constitutes physical, verifiable evidence? No, ma'am, he said, quieter now. Jasmine didn't gloat. She let the silence speak instead. A long pause. Every eye was on her. She turned toward the bench again, her tone sharpening. Your Honor, Whitaker, Your Honor, Monroe. This officer just admitted, under oath, that his entire case is based on subjective judgment, not probable cause, not statutory measurement, just a feeling. She tapped the side of her folder. And yet a $15,000 fine was levied. Not on proof, not on documentation, but on what one man thought he saw? Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. He didn't say anything, but his silence no longer felt neutral. Jasmine stepped forward again, lowering her voice. This isn't about Officer Ellis. It's about the standard we accept in a court of law. If this is allowed to stand, if a fine can be imposed without a shred of real evidence, then every citizen is just one bad mood away from a financial death sentence. Because what Ellis is calling enforcement, the Constitution calls arbitrary, and the courts call it unconstitutional. She turned back toward the gallery, scanning the faces. Some looked stunned, others disturbed. A few, like the younger attorneys in the back row, looked newly awakened, as if they were watching the very definition of power imbalance being dismantled in real time. She returned her focus to the officer. Final question, Officer Ellis. If someone were to challenge your citation, like we are now, what evidence would you offer this court to support your decision? Ellis looked at the judges, then at Jasmine. He hesitated. His throat moved as he swallowed. I would say that I acted within the scope of my training and experience. Noted, Jasmine replied, voice sharp as glass. So we are left with this, a $15,000 punishment based solely on one man's memory, with zero physical evidence and no oversight. Then she said it, the line that cracked the room open. So what you're calling a citation, officer, is really just your opinion in uniform, a fine dressed up in personal belief. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was electric, thick. Every person in that courtroom realized the weight of what had just been said. The state's case wasn't just weak, it was hollow. The emperor had no clothes, and Jasmine had just called it out with a surgeon's grace. Whitaker leaned back slightly in his chair. Monroe looked down at his bench, lips pressed thin. The prosecutor didn't speak. He couldn't. Because anything said in defense of Ellis now would only confirm how far this had gone off the rails. Jasmine took a single step back. Not in retreat, but in finality. Her message had landed. The system that tried to steamroll her now sat in stunned silence, facing the simple truth she had dragged into the light. You cannot punish without proof. Not in this courtroom, not today, not anymore. Jasmine turned back toward the bench, her hand resting gently on the folder that now lay open like a loaded weapon. Her voice lowered, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted every person in the room to lean in and listen. Your Honors, she said, looking first at Whitaker, then Monroe. You've heard the legal precedent. You've heard the procedural failure. But let's not pretend this is about paper anymore. This is about people. Real people who never got the chance to stand in this courtroom. People who were crushed by the weight of invisible authority. Just like I nearly was today. She slowly flipped a page inside the folder, then held it in the air. Let me introduce you to Daniel Reese, Vietnam veteran, lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He came home from war with shrapnel in his leg and a dream in his gut, to open his own repair garage. He spent 2 decades building it, saved every dime, rebuilt transmissions by hand, helped other vets for free when they were down on their luck. And then one day, out of nowhere, the city emailed him saying his business license was suspended. Not revoked for misconduct, not flagged for safety violations. Suspended because of an administrative oversight. His online renewal was missing one checkbox. Just one. No phone call, no warning. Just a line of red text in a government database. She let the silence sit for a moment. The judge's pen hovered above the paper, but didn't move. The gallery was absolutely still. He tried to appeal, but no one would hear him. They said the system had auto-flagged his file, and while he was trying to fight that invisible machine, customers left. Rent piled up. Within 3 months, Daniel was out of business. He lost his shop, then his house. The city finally admitted the mistake, 6 months later. You know what they gave him? Jasmine's voice cracked slightly. A letter of apology, typed, no signature. She turned the page. Karen Bautista, Savannah, Georgia, master electrician. 15 years, no accidents, no violations. She trained apprentices, ran her own crew. Then one year, the city quietly changed the licensing codes. Suddenly, her state license was labeled non-transferable under revised municipal standards. No one could explain what that meant. Not the board, not the clerk. But they told her she couldn't pull permits anymore, couldn't inspect, couldn't work. She was told to start over. Like her career had never existed. She fought it. She asked for clarity. She even filed a public records request, and they denied it, saying the transition policy was internal. Jasmine inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly, controlling not just her breath, but the entire rhythm of the courtroom. She looked straight at Monroe, and her voice sharpened like a scalpel. And what did they call that decision, Your Honor? Standardization. That's the word they used. Cold, bureaucratic, standardization. She paused again. She eventually moved to Florida to start again. She lost her crew, her contracts, her home, her name, and no one was ever held accountable. Now came the final story. She placed the last page on top of the stack, then looked out at the gallery before speaking. James Weller, 62, retired long-haul trucker, lived outside Waco, Texas, used his pension to buy a small piece of land, built a cedar fence with his own 2 hands. It was 17 inches over the city's invisible property line. 17. The city said he was encroaching on public land and fined him over $10,000. When he asked for a land survey, they told him, quote, "It's already been decided." He couldn't afford a lawyer, couldn't afford an appeal, So he tore the whole fence down by hand, in the heat, in the dust. Took him 2 days. Jasmine's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. On the third day, they find him again, this time for incomplete demolition, because some posts were still in the ground. The courtroom was a vacuum now. No one shifted, no one coughed. Even Monroe had stopped pretending to look busy. Everyone felt it, the weight of what Jasmine had just dragged into the light. These weren't statistics, they were scars. They were the evidence that the system, when left to its own ego, becomes a predator. Jasmine turned her full attention to Judge Whitaker. So let's stop pretending this is just a hearing about a minor fine. Let's stop pretending I'm the only one this has happened to. Her voice rose, not in anger, but in conviction. What happened to Daniel, Karen, and James wasn't some freak accident. It wasn't a glitch. It was power with no brakes, a system that can ruin a life without ever proving a thing. And it's the same thing that nearly happened to me today. She raised her hand, palm open. No evidence, no documentation, no witnesses, just one officer's opinion in a courtroom willing to stamp it without question. What if I hadn't shown up with this folder? What if I hadn't known the law? What if I had just paid the fine, like most people do, and walked away thinking I'd done something wrong? She looked around the room. That's how it happens. That's how people give up. That's how injustice survives. It wears the face of official procedure and waits for no one to challenge it. She returned her eyes to Whitaker, her tone now quiet but iron solid. Unchecked power is not justice. It is a loaded weapon in the hands of men who forget who they serve. And then the final line, the one that brought the entire courtroom to the edge. Power that answers to no one doesn't protect the people. It hunts them, slowly, quietly, until one day it knocks on your door and there's no one left to stand in the way. And for a long moment after she finished, not a single word was said, because there was nothing left to say. The silence after Jasmine's final statement was not just heavy. It was crushing, the kind that wraps around a courtroom like a storm about to break. Judge Monroe stared at her for a moment too long, lips pressed into a hard line, as if trying to calculate the cost of what he was about to say. His fingers twitched once against the polished wood of the bench. He looked down, then back up, and finally spoke. Not with the thunderous authority he had used earlier, but with a colder, calculated defiance. This court, he said slowly, retains the right of judicial discretion. We are not bound to accept every argument brought before us simply because it is forcefully delivered. His tone was firm, but hollow. When necessary, this court exercises its authority to maintain order and enforce compliance. That authority, he added, is not up for debate. It was a thin veil, a final, desperate swing to reclaim control, not based on law, but on ego. The courtroom felt it. Everyone did. This wasn't justice speaking. This was a man grasping for the last thread of power slipping from his hands. He wasn't defending the ruling. He was defending himself. Jasmine didn't react immediately. She let the air settle, let his words hang awkwardly in the stillness. Then she stepped forward, just once. Her voice was quieter now, but it carried like a razor through the room. Your Honor, she said, eyes locked on Monroe. Judicial discretion does not mean judicial supremacy. The power of this bench, of any bench, exists only within the bounds of the law. She turned slightly, addressing the entire room. Discretion is not a shield for error. It is not a sword for bias. It is a tool meant to be used with care, never in place of evidence, and certainly never in place of the truth. She turned back to Monroe, her voice tightening. This fine was imposed with no documentation, no physical proof, no witnesses, just a single officer's unverified claim. You called it enforcement, but what it is assumption. A $15,000 punishment based on nothing but a feeling. That's not discretion. That's lawlessness wearing a robe. Monroe's jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like he might snap back, raise his voice, issue another blanket statement. But before he could speak, Judge Whitaker shifted forward. He hadn't said a word in minutes, but now his voice came with slow, deliberate finality. I've heard enough, he said, not loud, but with the kind of weight that silences everything else. Miss Crockett is correct. Judicial discretion cannot override constitutional standards. It cannot substitute fact with assumption. The impact of that sentence landed hard. You could feel it. The gallery went still. No whispers, no movement. Even Monroe didn't look at Whitaker, because he didn't have to. He already knew what that meant. The moment Whitaker voiced agreement, the floor beneath Monroe's entire argument crumbled. Whitaker continued, his tone measured but absolute. In this case, we have no supporting documentation, no corroborating witness, and no substantive evidence to justify the penalty. The officer's statement, unverified, unsupported, does not meet the evidentiary threshold required for enforcement. He paused not for effect, but for clarity. This court cannot and should not uphold a fine on the basis of personal interpretation alone. If we do, we set precedent not for justice, but for unchecked power. Monroe sat completely still, his hands now folded tightly in front of him. He didn't speak. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't deepen the hole already dug around him. His authority had been challenged and then dismantled in his own courtroom. He had tried to override process with presence, precedent with posture, but now in front of the very people he once intimidated with silence, he had no standing left. Finally, after a pause so long it bordered on unbearable, Monroe leaned slightly forward. His voice, when it returned, was brittle and forced. This court, he began, eyes low, finds that there is insufficient evidentiary support to sustain the penalty imposed under Municipal Code 22F. He swallowed once, and the gavel in his hand remained untouched. Accordingly, the fine is vacated. The charge is dismissed. The words hung in the air, not as victory, but as acknowledgement of failure, of overreach, of a system that nearly crushed someone who simply refused to bow to it. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't even nod. She simply stood, calm, composed, as if the dismissal was inevitable. Because to her, it was. Not because the system worked, but because she had forced it to. The gallery remained still, stunned. Even the prosecutor sat motionless, hands folded tightly, eyes lowered. No one spoke, and yet everyone understood what had just happened. Jasmine hadn't just won a legal battle. She had exposed a rot. She had walked into a courtroom where everything was against her. Timing, posture, reputation, even the judge. And she had torn the walls down brick by brick, using only truth, law, and clarity. Judge Monroe, the man who began the day wielding absolute control, now sat quiet, outranked, out-argued, outmaneuvered. And in his silence, the message was clear. The court hadn't ruled in Jasmine's favor. It had surrendered to her refusal to be erased. This wasn't a fine being dismissed. This was a system being reminded of its purpose. The courtroom had settled into a silence so profound that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to pause in reverence to what had just transpired. The day had begun with the kind of tension that promised nothing more than a routine administrative hearing, a case that should have been a mere footnote in the docket. Yet as the hours passed, the atmosphere had transformed into a crucible of power, prejudice, and defiant truth. Now, with the final ruling delivered and the weight of injustice hanging palpably in the air, the scene before the judges, attorneys, and every silent witness was one of irrevocable change. Judge Monroe, whose earlier words had dripped with unchallenged authority, now sat motionless behind his bench, his eyes fixed on the worn wood before him. The authority he had clung to had evaporated in the wake of Jasmine Crockett's relentless pursuit of due process. It was in that charged moment, the courtroom frozen in time, that the inevitable confrontation with truth had begun, a truth that would not be silenced by power, no matter how heavily draped in a robe. After what felt like an eternity of stillness, Monroe's gaze finally lifted, meeting Jasmine's unwavering stare. His voice, once a booming assertion of control, came out in a strained, almost defeated murmur. "I underestimated you." Those words, so casually whispered yet loaded with the bitter sting of concession, broke through the oppressive silence like a shard of glass. They were not meant for public consumption. They were a private acknowledgement of his failure to anticipate the strength of her resolve. Jasmine, standing tall and unbowed at the front of the courtroom, allowed a slight, measured smile to play at the corners of her mouth. A smile not of triumph, but of quiet vindication. "You wouldn't be the first, sir," she replied softly, her voice carrying a calm defiance that resonated with every person present. In that brief exchange, the dynamic of the room had shifted irrevocably. The heavy burden of unchallenged authority was lifted just a fraction, replaced by the dawning recognition that true justice required more than power. It required accountability. For a long moment, the courtroom remained suspended in this bittersweet pause. The silence was not empty. It was brimming with the collective realization that what had occurred was more than a legal victory. It was the birth of a precedent that would reverberate far beyond these walls. Without another word, Jasmine turned away from the bench. Each step she took down the polished marble aisle was measured, resonating with the rhythmic click of her heels as if punctuating the beat of a revolution. Every step was a testament to the countless hours of preparation, the battles fought in smaller rooms, and the courage summoned in moments when the weight of injustice threatened to crush the spirit of the vulnerable. The gallery watched in hushed awe as she passed by rows of silent spectators, many of whom now understood that they were witnessing not just a legal decision, but a transformation of the very fabric of the system. Her steady march was a silent declaration that, even when power is misused and the scales of justice are tipped by unchecked authority, the voice of truth can still rise to reclaim what is rightfully ours. Outside, the corridors of the courthouse echoed with the sound of her footsteps, a sound that carried far beyond the immediate realm of legal proceedings. The daylight that spilled through the grand entrance seemed almost symbolic, a metaphor for transparency and hope, breaking through the murk of corruption and hidden abuses. As Jasmine reached the heavy oak doors, she paused momentarily. With a final backward glance, she observed the room where Monroe's defeat was etched in every furrow of his brow and in every silent nod of agreement from those who had dared to stand with her. In that fleeting moment, the eyes of every person in the room, from the junior clerks to the seasoned lawyers, bore witness to a truth that could no longer be denied. The law was not a tool for oppression, but a shield for the people. The door creaked open, and with one final resolute step, Jasmine emerged into the corridor, bathed in soft, forgiving light. The hum of the world outside resumed as if acknowledging the significance of what had just occurred. But within her, the victory was complex. It was not a triumph celebrated with cheers or accolades. Instead, it was a precedent, etched into the annals of this courtroom and destined to influence every future case where power threatened to overwhelm justice. The injustice she had faced was not unique. It was systemic, rooted in a culture of unchecked authority that had long oppressed the voices of the marginalized. Yet by standing her ground and demanding accountability, she had carved a path for change. Her actions today were a reminder that true power lies not in the ability to silence dissent, but in the courage to confront it head-on. Every detail of the day would be remembered. The cold, calculated tone of Monroe's ruling, the palpable tension that had filled every corner of the room, and the way the gallery had collectively held its breath as the final verdict was announced. Those moments, seemingly small yet infinitely significant, were the sparks that could ignite a broader movement for justice. The injustice of a fine imposed without evidence, the arrogance of a system that assumed guilt without proof, these were not isolated incidents, but part of a much larger narrative. And now, thanks to Jasmine's unwavering resolve, that narrative had been disrupted. Within the courtroom, a subtle but undeniable change had taken root. Judges who once presided over cases with an iron fist might now think twice before issuing rulings without due process. Prosecutors, previously content to operate within the confines of an unjust system, might now find themselves challenged by the very precedents they had taken for granted. And every citizen who had ever felt the sting of arbitrary power, those who had lost their livelihoods, their dignity, or even their homes, now had a beacon of hope. For in Jasmine's measured defiance, in her unyielding demand for the truth, lay the promise of accountability. The law, when left unchecked, becomes a weapon, a tool for the powerful to crush the weak. But when that same law is wielded by those who respect its principles, it becomes a shield. Today, Jasmine had shown the world that the shield could be reclaimed, that even in the face of overwhelming institutional power, justice could find a way. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the murmurs of conversation began to rise again, soft at first, then louder, as if everyone was trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Some whispered about the improbability of such a moment. A judge admitting his error, a system buckling under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Others spoke of Jasmine's courage in hushed tones, reverently discussing the implications of her actions for future cases. Every whisper, every exchanged glance, reinforced the fact that this was no ordinary dismissal. This was a watershed moment, a turning point in the ongoing battle against systemic injustice. Even Judge Whitaker, whose measured authority had been a constant throughout the proceedings, seemed to radiate a quiet sense of resolve. His eyes, which had earlier scrutinized every move with detached precision, now shone with a hint of satisfaction, a silent affirmation that the scales of justice had been righted, at least in this instance. And though Judge Monroe had been forced to issue a ruling that vacated the fine, his part in this drama was over. The finality of his statement, "The fine is hereby vacated, the charges dismissed," was not so much a victory as it was an admission that his earlier assertions had been untenable. It was as if he had been caught in the act of subverting the law, and with no recourse left, was forced to retreat in defeat. In the weeks that followed, the reverberations of that day would be felt far beyond the courthouse walls. Legal journals would cite the case as a pivotal moment in administrative law, a clear example of how unchecked power could be dismantled by a single, determined voice standing for what was right. Law schools would discuss the case as a turning point in the interpretation of judicial discretion, and practicing attorneys would recall the day as when the very essence of due process was defended with unwavering conviction. Yet for Jasmine, the significance was deeply personal. It wasn't just about a fine being overturned. It was about reclaiming a sense of dignity that had been chipped away by years of systemic bias and bureaucratic indifference. Every step she took that day, from the moment she first walked into the courtroom to the final echo of her footsteps as she left, was a testament to the power of perseverance. It was a reminder that the law, in its truest form, was not a tool for oppression, but a mechanism for justice, a means to ensure that every individual, regardless of their background or station, was given a fair hearing. And as she exited the courthouse, the world outside seemed to breathe a little easier, as if the weight of injustice had momentarily lifted. Jasmine's journey was far from over. There would be more battles, more moments when the system would try to silence voices of reason with bureaucratic might. But that day in that sacred chamber of justice, she had proved something vital, that even the most entrenched power could be challenged, that the law was not an infallible decree of the mighty, but a living, breathing promise to protect the vulnerable. It was a promise she had reaffirmed with every word, every citation, every measured step. As the heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind her, sealing off the space where history had been rewritten, a sense of quiet determination filled the corridors. The echoes of her defiant stance would linger in those halls, a constant reminder that when power goes unchecked, it becomes a weapon. But when questioned, when held accountable, that same power can be harnessed to uplift and protect. The precedent had been set, not with a grand celebratory fanfare, but with the steady, unyielding march of truth, echoed by a woman who refused to be silenced. In that moment, as the light of the afternoon filtered in through the tall windows and cast long, dramatic shadows across the floor, every person present felt the shift. The scales of justice had tilted, if only for a moment, in favor of accountability. And though the battle was won without the clamor of victory, it was a victory nonetheless. A victory of conscience over corruption, of evidence over assumption, of due process over despotic discretion. Jasmine walked away from the courtroom not as a triumphant conqueror, but as someone who had borne the weight of injustice and, by standing firm, had lifted a small corner of it. Her eyes held the promise of more fights to come, a silent vow that she would never again allow unchecked power to crush the rights of the few. And as the courthouse doors swung shut behind her, Sealing away the echoes of that fateful day, the legacy of her courage began to seep into every crevice of the legal system. A legacy that would remind future generations that no one is above the law, and that sometimes the greatest victories are the precedents that force a system to change. In the days, months, and years that followed, those who had witnessed the trial would speak of it with reverence and caution. Legal scholars would debate the implications, citing the case as an example of what can happen when a judge's unchecked discretion is finally held to account. Young attorneys would carry the memory of that day like a beacon, a reminder that the law could be both a sword and a shield when wielded with integrity. And for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of bureaucratic overreach, Jasmine's resolute stand would become a symbol, a testament that even in the darkest moments, one voice, anchored in truth, could change the course of history. The courtroom had not merely witnessed a ruling, it had witnessed a transformation. Transformation of power, of process, and of the collective understanding of what it meant to serve justice. And though Judge Monroe's final words had been delivered in a voice weakened by defeat, the message that resonated through the halls of that courthouse was undeniable. Justice, when stripped of evidence and due process, is nothing more than an empty shell. It is a system that must be questioned, held accountable, and ultimately reformed. Jasmine's quiet departure was not an end, but the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where every ruling would be scrutinized, every fine justified, and every enforcement measure grounded in verifiable fact. As she disappeared into the fading light, her silhouette mingled with the shadows of the courthouse, leaving behind an indelible mark on every heart and mind present that day. It was a reminder that while the battle against systemic injustice might be long and arduous, each victory, each precedent, brings us one step closer to a world where power is truly held in check, and every individual is given the respect and protection they deserve. And so the day ended not with the triumphant roar of victory, but with a solemn acknowledgement of the hard-won truth, that true justice is not handed over on a judge's whim, but is earned through unwavering courage, relentless inquiry, and the steadfast refusal to let power go unchecked. Jasmine Crockett had not only reclaimed her dignity, she had rekindled a flame that would light the way for all who believed that the law should serve the people, not the other way around. In the weeks following Jasmine Crockett's groundbreaking courtroom victory, a tremor of change began to ripple through cities across the nation. Municipal offices that had long relied on unchecked discretion were suddenly forced to re-examine hundreds of fines issued without a single shred of evidence. It started in a modest Midwestern city when a local attorney's inquiry into an arbitrary $15,000 penalty revealed that over 100 fines had been levied solely on the basis of an officer's personal judgment. One by one, city after city found themselves compelled to sift through old records and audit enforcement practices that had, for too long, been shrouded in bureaucratic secrecy. The discovery was staggering. Thousands of citizens had been financially crippled by fines that were not backed by any physical documentation, witness testimony, or objective measurement. Community outrage began to swell as people realized that these penalties, once seen as isolated administrative errors, were actually part of a systemic failure that allowed unchecked power to reign. The realization sent shockwaves through local governments, which now faced intense public scrutiny and the urgent demand for transparency and reform. Officials scrambled to explain how fines had been imposed based solely on the opinion of a single officer without any corroborating evidence, and many found themselves caught in the glare of an enraged public. In a matter of weeks, the narrative shifted from isolated incidents to a national reckoning with administrative overreach. Jasmine Crockett's victory in that fateful courtroom became the spark that ignited a nationwide movement for reform. Her case, meticulously documented and boldly argued, was cited as a watershed moment by legal scholars and activists alike. It wasn't long before municipalities across the country began reviewing their own records, and in some cities, hundreds of fines were rescinded after it was revealed that they had been imposed without proper evidence. In boardrooms and city council meetings, officials were forced to confront a bitter truth. A system that allowed fines to be based on personal opinion rather than verifiable fact was inherently flawed and dangerous. Grassroots organizations sprang into action, demanding that local governments establish stricter guidelines for evidence-based enforcement and hold officers accountable for arbitrary decisions. The momentum of this movement was palpable. Communities that had once felt powerless in the face of bureaucratic overreach now found their voices amplified. Protests in public forums erupted, where citizens demanded transparency and the promise that no one would ever again suffer the consequences of an officer's unchecked discretion. Through every new policy review and every overturned fine, Jasmine's case was cited as a beacon of hope, a powerful reminder that when the people demand accountability, even the mightiest institutions can be compelled to change. As the story gained traction, the media continued to cast a bright light on the sweeping changes that were unfolding. Television networks, newspapers, and online platforms ran constant coverage of the emerging reforms. Major news programs returned with follow-up reports on the sweeping audits, documenting how cities in Texas, Florida, and New York were grappling with the fallout of a system that had long operated without sufficient checks. In one memorable segment, 60 Minutes showcased interviews with former victims of arbitrary fines, business owners, veterans, and everyday citizens, whose stories resonated with viewers around the country. These personal accounts, raw and unfiltered, revealed the true human cost of punitive measures imposed without evidence. They recounted tales of financial ruin, shattered dreams, and a pervasive sense of injustice that had left entire communities distrustful of those in power. The reporters presented hard-hitting statistics that demonstrated how thousands of fines, ranging from a few $100s to tens of thousands, had been levied in error over the past decade. With each story, it became increasingly clear that the problem was not isolated, but systemic, and it demanded urgent reform. The public was riveted, and the pressure on local officials mounted to explain, justify, and ultimately change the flawed processes that had led to so many unwarranted penalties. For Jasmine Crockett, the impact of her courtroom victory was both profound and far-reaching. She had not only defended her own rights, but had also laid a crucial cornerstone in the edifice of American justice. Her case served as a catalyst for reform, a turning point that exposed the dangers of unchecked administrative power and ignited a nationwide movement to protect citizens from arbitrary enforcement. Legal experts began to refer to her case as a landmark precedent, a reminder that the law must always be grounded in evidence, transparency, and fairness. Law schools began incorporating her arguments into their curricula, teaching new generations of attorneys the importance of fighting for due process. Conferences and seminars buzzed with discussions about the need for stricter oversight of municipal enforcement, and policymakers across the country cited her case as a reason to overhaul outdated practices. Jasmine's steadfast determination had transformed her personal battle into a broader crusade for justice, ensuring that every citizen would be better protected against the misuse of power. Across the nation, communities that had once been silenced by the weight of bureaucratic indifference now found their voices. The reforms triggered by her case brought hope to those who had suffered under a system that prioritized authority over fairness. With each overturned fine and every revised policy, the promise of a more just and equitable system began to take shape. The legacy of Jasmine Crockett's victory was not measured in loud declarations or fleeting moments of triumph. It was etched into the daily lives of ordinary people who no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary punishment. It became a beacon for future generations, a reminder that when power is left unchecked, it can only serve as a threat to the rights of the people. But when challenged, held accountable, and reformed, that same power can become a force for good, protecting the very principles upon which this nation was built. In the end, Jasmine Crockett did more than win a legal battle. She changed the course of history. Her courage in the face of injustice inspired a movement that re-examined and reformed a system marred by arbitrary fines and unverified claims. Her victory was not a solitary moment of triumph, but a spark that ignited widespread reform, one that reshaped how administrative power was exercised, ensuring that every penalty would be supported by evidence and administered with fairness. In doing so, she laid a new cornerstone in American justice, one that would stand as a testament to the enduring power of truth, accountability, and the unyielding resolve of those who dare to stand up against oppression. Her story became a rallying cry for every citizen who had ever felt powerless, a symbol of the fact that when you question authority, when you demand evidence, and when you insist on due process, you can indeed change the world. And though the road ahead remained long and filled with challenges, Jasmine Crockett's legacy shone as a reminder that the fight for justice is never over, and that even the smallest voice can echo loudly enough to reshape an entire nation. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.